Checking meter is 22. Okay, and yeah, I took some snapshot slides here that are like something like this. Generally, I don't include. I'm going to gloss over that quickly. It's really not relevant here. These are the things I'm in English. It's really just keeping it centered on the text and then I'll try to keep it, well, because I'll have the benefit of hearing you go, I'll know what not to say. I try to keep it kind of canned.
Luckily, I know where the lights are, because I used to have keys. Okay, so this is the September 1st, 2021, Community Board 11 Ad Hoc Zoning Committee meeting. It's about 7:35. In attendance tonight is Michael Ludovin, who's chairing this committee of one. Also, yeah, committee of one. Also Scott Solomon from City Planning and Al Silvestri from the Department of Transportation. The information here inside this presentation will be given to the board via minutes and via email before the September 13th public hearing. And that's it with that. I'll turn it over to Mike, who in turn, I believe might turn it over to Scott.
Yes, thanks very much, Joe. Appreciate it. Appreciate you guys coming tonight. Thank you. We can get right to it. You guys can go to the presentation. I'll let you know if you have any questions.
Great. I was talking to Al before. Generally, the way these are sort of structured, it almost makes more sense for Al to go first. He teased up a lot of what I have to say, so I'm going to defer to you first, Al.
Sure. All right, good seeing everyone. Person across the room. So yeah, we're here to talk about the permanent open restaurants program. So at a very high level, the permanent program will be run by DOT. We've gone through, learned a lot of lessons over the last year and a half plus, and we've had different agencies involved with enforcement. We've had the old sidewalk cafe program, and we're going to go into some details, and we can go into as much detail or as much high level stuff as you guys are comfortable with. But as you know, the city had cafes before COVID, but in much smaller quantities. So we want to give a brief summary of. You guys have copies of the presentation, right? Okay. So let's go. I'll work off of yours.
Okay, that's quite limited to the text, but it helps.
Yeah. So slide 2. What are we really talking about? The process that we're here and we're discussing with every community board is doing a rule change that will allow the entire program to fall under the umbrella of DOT, and also expand the universe of locations citywide. So, because right now, depending, and Scott will talk about this, depending on your location, depending on the zoning, depending on whether or not you've been grandfathered, that affects your ability for a cafe. So let's go into slide 3.
We could piggyback if you think it works here. Come back.
Because I think
my slide deck is different than yours.
yours is a little different. All right, you know what? Let me go through a couple key points about the background of the project, and then we'll piggyback talking about the zone.
Okay.
All right. Because I did this at CB5, but it was a different presentation, was a little different. So, just so I'm not, reiterating things. So, summer of 2020, New York City revisited its rules and suspended many of them to allow for restaurants to serve diners outdoors. And that temporary program helped save about 11,000 restaurants and an estimate of about 100,000 jobs in those establishments. It allowed restaurants to continue serving outdoors on the sidewalk and on the road, we were both. Mike, Joe, we had conversations early on about, in particular, the Boulevard, and how it was, a good opportunity for the Bayside Village bid, and it did work well for them. A couple hiccups along the way, but overall, it was actually a really successful program, and I think Christine at the bid would agree with that. The program, as in the emergency form, did not require a participation fee. And what it did was it eliminated a lengthy design review process. So it was no longer going to consumer affairs and submitting drawings and all that. It was basically about self-certification, and it required the city to inspect locations and to offer specific siting guidelines as to how restaurants could set up their outdoor dining. So the mayor announced in September of 2020 that open restaurants would be permanent year-round. To make it permanent, and this is what I was alluding to before, it requires a series of legal changes, including the text amendment change to allow more locations to be eligible. And Scott will talk more about that. So the vision for the permanent program, let's talk about that. Sidewalk and roadway seating will be administered and enforced by DOT. That's the vision. So no longer sidewalk cafes under DCWP, grandfathered status will just be folded into the new open restaurant program. It will be available throughout the city. It will require removable tables and chairs. It'll have the same kind of siting guidelines, the clear path, ADA requirements that we have now, 8-foot clear path on the sidewalk, and the other siting criteria that are in place for safety purposes. And the same rules of operation, so sound, hours of operation, etc. So we're in the process now, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, of refining that information. We're really right now, step one is getting that text amendment in place to get the program in a permanent status. So sidewalk seating. Similar to what we've seen, all restaurants with ground floor space, so no restaurants that are on a third story. And you don't really have this in CB11, but ground floor space that meet the sidewalk width and passage requirements for pedestrians will be able to apply. So 8-foot or 50% clear path requirement for location. There is talk of providing a waiver for restaurants that are demonstrating accessibility, and that accessibility pedestrian needs can be met, but that's still going to be pretty strict, and we're going to get guidance from the mayor's office for people with disabilities on that. Roadway seating. Okay. Remember, this is what the permanent program, this is the vision for the permanent program. Setups will be allowed citywide in parking lane, except in prohibited zones. So same as today, no bus stops, no standing zones. Can't be in front of a hydrant. A lot of restaurants will come to us in the early stages and say, this isn't fair, there's a hydrant in front of me, why can't? And, the situation was what it was, That's ultimately what we had to tell folks. The program was put in place, but there were still safety requirements that we had to comply with. The thing with the roadway seating, the two main things we want to talk about there is better guidance that we're refining now on how enclosed they can be. The idea being, especially corner locations, you want drivers to be able to have some visibility. It's pedestrians as well, to be able to look through a setup and ensure, that activity at an intersection is safe. That's really the main thing when it comes to enclosed or, not. The second thing is removal. The roadway is going to be a seasonal setup. All right. Let's see what.
Yeah, I guess.
I'm trying to
I got some
put
conversation.
my thumb to, same thing, when restaurants have to be able to, they can't, block off permanent sidewalk furniture. We've seen, restaurants build around union meters, bike racks, things like that. That's going to be, much more strongly enforced. Okay? And the one thing that I definitely want to hammer home is the enforcement, and this program is being a new program. We anticipate additional funding to really beef up the enforcement aspect, and it'll be totally under DOT's umbrella to enforce setups. So clearer guidance, stronger enforcement, and what else? Top line items that I think that you should know. It'll be fee-based too. Okay, so the, remind me again, how many years?
Years of,
Once you apply?
it's a good question. I don't know how long the terms of that.
Yeah, I think it's still being worked out, but I think it'll be at least a 2-year term where once you apply and you're accepted and you build your fee will be good for a certain amount of time, but you'll still be subject to inspection. So it's not like you pay your fee, you're good to go. You're gonna be, same thing, 311, community board polls, anybody, we're still gonna be inspecting and making sure that it complies by all the guidelines.
Okay.
So just in case, because, sadly, some restaurants try to pull a fast one and they'll have a setup and then they'll augment it over time.
Yeah.
And be out of compliance.
Yeah.
Yeah. So which presentation do you have right in front of you?
I handed
This was
them,
just yours?
I just handed them the text amendment part,
Okay,
following your.
got it, okay. Okay, so what, Joe, I'll make sure I apologize about that. We'll make sure that you get all slides. I mean, it's all on the website.
Yeah.
It's on our website and DCP's. It's the same presentation that everybody did. We'll make sure that you get it. And because there's just some diagrams in here about, specific clearance requirements from roadway and sidewalk obstructions,
Yeah.
and things like that. But the top line item is the details of the siting requirements and the guidelines are still being fleshed out. DOT, we've learned a lot through the process, and we think that permanent program, we're going to be able to really have some very specific, strict guidelines based upon what we've learned. That coupled with the feedback we get from every community board and the enhanced enforcement that we have, ultimately will make this run a lot more smoothly.
And Al, if you don't mind, correct me if I'm wrong, so a lot of what he's referring to, these design requirements, setting up a fee structure, that, when you look at the second slide, what I provided here, it's similar to what he has, which is, those 2 and 3 are sort of subject to anticipated local law and rule-making process at DOT. Those are steps 2 and 3. And those really set up the programmatic side of this, the sidewalk cafe and roadway program. So these are the anticipated framework for those programs. The step 1 that I have, the zoning framework, is fixing the zoning part that allows them to then proceed. So it doesn't have a fee structure based in zoning, it doesn't have the design requirements in zoning. So when we get one of the zoning proposal, it's very narrow and just, and if I had an elevator part of it is removing the sidewalk cafe requirements of zoning.
Yeah.
Because they're geographically limited to certain areas.
Yeah, so pre-COVID, right, restaurants went to DCWP for sidewalk cafes. And they had to do a whole extensive process, engineering drawings, insurance, license fees, sent to DCWP. They reviewed it, applications were forwarded to community boards, and then potentially to the city council for public hearings. And then sent to the controller for registration, and it was a process that could take 6+ months for restaurants. So the idea here is to take the legal authority to run the sidewalk program, put everything under DOT, because it's within Map City right of way. Restaurants will come to one agency, they won't have to file engineering drawings, they can file online. They will have to pay a fee, I'm sorry, I have it here. Restaurants will have a 4-year license, but will be subject to periodic check. So it's a 4-year. And DOT will create detailed visual instructions to ensure restaurants set clear guidelines. And the city will fund a robust enforcement unit within DOT to ensure that the restaurants and the general public can interact with and make sure that the setups are in compliance.
Al, maybe it's okay to maybe there's a good pivot point.
The next step is how this advances and what the 3 steps are, so.
Great, yeah. So, just picking back again on what you're saying, so there's 3 real parts to this, 3 components. What I'm really focusing on is the first component is the text amendment itself. So there are some unnecessary zoning restrictions that stand in the way of this. So the zoning proposal is really to unlock the ability to have sidewalk cafes. We can't have them today. They're limited geographically today. So when we look at, it's tough to do it here. That I can do, right? Can't physically not open that.
Slide 11.
So I'm gonna move right on to slide 3, which is just a high level summary of the changes here. So the text amendment is removing the entirety of Chapter 1, Article 4 of the zoning resolution, related text in special districts and other areas that relate to sidewalk cafes, to fully remove zoning and dictating locations of sidewalk cafes. So this will allow any restaurant to apply to DOT for a sidewalk cafe. So this is the text that's facilitating everything that will be set up by DOT. The program itself, you would be limited in certain geographies where this could happen. We're eliminating that limitation. Like a little rainbow. So again, a brief background here. So in March 2020, there were roughly 27,000 restaurants in the city. Again, the purpose of this presentation is focusing on the ground floor restaurants with access to the street, as these are the only restaurants that could apply for this program that Al is referring to. So we went to slide 5. So the laws governing sidewalk cafes have evolved over the years. From a land use perspective, ULURP came into existence in the 1970s. Sidewalk cafe approvals were subject to the full ULURP review as part of its revocable consent to use street space. Almost immediately, it was recognized as this was an onerous process, costly, time-consuming. So in 1980, the City Planning Commission put into a framework attempting to streamline this process by naming specific areas in the city where sidewalk cafes were allowed. Since then, the program has been amended dozens of times, and then up to COVID-19, the zoning worked as a gatekeeper, really, to where sidewalk cafes could be located.
I love the history behind it.
Gotta keep it brief, and anytime I can talk about how ULURP really pigeonholes a lot of progress, sometimes it's, even we can admit to it at city planning. So above we have a brief synopsis of the pre-COVID environment for sidewalk cafes. Under the zoning rules, which are currently suspended, zoning dictates 3 different types of cafes and where in the city they can be located. Most commonly, unenclosed cafes, which allow for readily movable tables, chairs, and fencing with no allowable overhead coverage other than umbrellas or retractable roofs. Then the middle, small sidewalk cafes is an unenclosed sidewalk cafe containing no more than a single row of tables. And part of this is just to also familiarize you and anyone who's watching this with some of the language or vernacular of the sidewalk cafe program. And then there's an enclosed cafe, which is defined as an extension of the building that is built into the sidewalk using light building materials. Moving on to slide 7. Zoning held these geographic restrictions where these type of cafes can be allowed. Anyone from the public can find this out quickly in Zola. There's a quick light player you can turn on and off. It shows you exactly where sidewalk cafes are allowed or not and certain different nuances. So the map on the right, yellow allows only small cafe types. Purple areas where only enclosed and small cafes are allowed. And green is where all cafe types are allowed. Important, you can see a lot of areas with cafes are not allowed at all. So if you look, if you live in Manhattan, you see some bright red popping out. These are specific prohibitions to sidewalk cafes in special districts. And then you can get out into the outer boroughs, especially in some more suburban parts of the city, in Queens, Staten Island, some Brooklyn. These are the residential areas without commercial overlays, commercial districts where you're not allowed to have a sidewalk cafe because the underlying zoning district doesn't allow restaurant or eating and drinking establishment.
So according to this, it was basically Northern Boulevard and Bell Boulevard.
Yeah, so, and I'm gonna get more specific to it, but you're right, yeah, but if you could think of, your main corridors here where you're allowed to have a sidewalk cafe, they're pretty much limited to these commercial corridors, the Bell, portions, Utopia, and then you have some of these little nooks here and there. And then you also have some grandfather properties here. So slide 8 is just illustrating that when in 2020, the existing DCWP program had about 1,224 cafes licensed. I'd say that more clearly licensed because you might see properties that exist, they're just not licensed. Those come through, but not that they weren't that prominent pre-2020 COVID. They existed, but they weren't prominent in some other neighborhoods. And the vast majority of these 1,224 were in Manhattan. If you look on the map above, I don't even think CB11 comes into the map at all. Moving on to slide 9. So in order to support the restaurant industry, as Al says, I'm going to skip through here, suspension of the existing zoning rules, existing rules at DCWP and DOT, relaxing to support these businesses at the time. Moving on to slide 10, about 11,500 restaurants have participated in the program, 10,000 restaurants on the sidewalk. I'm going to skip over that, just repeating what Al had already brought to your attention. Then in slide 11, so during the emergency program, 2,500 restaurants were permitted in areas that would have been prohibited or limited under the existing zoning. So these are areas that really brought to our attention how the sidewalk cafe zoning regulations were inhibiting or not really providing flexibility for sidewalk cafes. So the proposed text amendment will looking at the map to the right, in red are restaurants in specific areas that were prohibited by zoning. So again, these are special districts or areas where it's residential zoning, you're not allowed to build a restaurant as of today. These include commercial mid-blocks, again, the special districts. Blue are the grandfathered restaurants in residential areas. So you see a bunch of those in Eastern Queens. This isn't showing community district boundaries here, but later maps will show CB11 specifically. Slide 12, I'm just going to go through these slides pretty quickly. These are things that don't really apply to CB11 much, but these are areas where you wouldn't be allowed to do today in elevator railways. But we found that you really can have appropriate eating and drinking establishments with flexibility here. Special districts, these none of which are in CB11. Moving on to number 14. CBDs, central business districts, where they put on Grand Central, Midtown. So moving on, then grandfather restaurants, residential districts. There's a few of those in CB11. Restaurants that are not in otherwise commercial districts, but they've been allowed to exist and continue in existence because they were grandfathered in when the zoning either never began to not permit restaurants. So that brings us to slide 16. So as a consequence of the zoning rules, we're really combining these three different sidewalk cafes we talked about earlier into one. The slide above is showing where these small cafes are only limited. They're only limited in pretty much from portions of Manhattan, essentially, and splattering of Long Island City. Then finally, on slide 17, we're ending a program that the zoning program effectively ends a specific category in zoning called the enclosed cafe program. So those are those building properties that have this extension of the building, use light building materials. So this program served a specific purpose at the time, but which are no longer necessarily applicable in the context of future permanent program. So the future permanent program is looking for these flexible, removable enclosed cafes. We're not trying to facilitate new enclosed sidewalk cafes, although the 100+ that are in the city would be grandfathered in. But sidewalk cafes, would not be allowed to be doing these essentially larger buildings. Enclosed, extended buildings are not be allowed.
Yeah, that's one of the ways we're kind of getting away from the engineering requirements and the drawings, having to get partner buildings involved, the structural integrity of these things. It's just, it gets a lot more complicated when we start enclosing them like this.
The goal is not to facilitate these semi-permanent looking structures that are on, that essentially look like little sheds on streets, both the sidewalk and the roadway. So moving to slide 19 to get some more specific, some detail into CB11. Pre-COVID, shown here is a pre-COVID context, that had zoning rules that allow all cafes to establish commercial quarters. So these are the green popping out. The blue, again, is these residential areas. So it's just the blue and green from that ledger what you're looking at. Everything else doesn't apply to CB11. Then moving on to slide 20. Under the pre-COVID sidewalk cafes process, this district had 0 cafes. So again, this is licensed cafes, sidewalk cafes. You know, I know there's I'll call out specifically, there's a pizza place, a bagel place, they had I think a T-top table outside their store. You know, they probably didn't want to go through the bureaucratic mess of applying for that, so they don't pop up as sidewalk cafes. So there actually were none in CB11 and pre-COVID as far as licenses by DCWP. Under the emergency, then move on to slide 21. Under the emergency open restaurants program, there are 59 cafes in our CD. 13 of them would have been prohibited under current zoning. You can see that in areas that are blue. Doesn't really pop through in here, but what those 13 are in residential areas. So the one, I took a photo, a screenshot here is Pizza. These are grandfather properties. This is a commercial strip, I think it's 39th Avenue, if I recall correctly. And this is a residential area. So they today would not be allowed, or pre-COVID wouldn't be allowed a sidewalk cafe, but here they would continue to have this benefit to seek a license for a sidewalk cafe. And then finally, to summarize again, this chart on slide 22 is summarizing this process, and in the bottom blue line lines is the zoning text amendment and legislative action. What I was speaking about is the zoning text, and then further down, it's 2022, is the rulemaking process that Al was talking about, the design process, the fee structure, the new application process would likely begin the end of 2022, beginning of 2023, where that transition would come to fruition. So, it's important again to take the zoning text proposal, the text itself that is being referred to all 59 community boards. That in itself is essentially the removal again of the sidewalk cafe rules in the zoning text, but not necessarily the approval of the whole program that Al was referring to. That is still being put together.
Right, so it's safe to say that the existing program as we see it today will be in place at least through the end of 2020. So we're very, very early in the process. Hello, how are you?
So the
Anybody
first
got a
thing-
copy of this stuff for me?
Yes, yes.
I have too many of these, so you can take all of them or one of them. And as I was discussing, these slides pertain to the zoning text generally. Al also has a digital copy of the,
Yeah, I mean, the basics are in that. And then there's some site guideline stuff that I'm gonna send to the board as well.
yeah, and that, perfect time just where it's summarizing what it is that the board is going on, is the text amendment portion of it itself. But we're really glad and benefit from the support of DOT to provide guidance and sort of indicate where the program itself is going towards. And where to facilitate that, the text has to be cleaned up.
And so that's effectively the zoning locations that would have restricted these under the previous permanent program. Is that right?
So the previous,
So,
pre-COVID, the
The
pre-COVID,
pre-program program had zoning restrictions.
Yes.
This text amendment is going to remove. Is that right?
so it's just removing the sidewalk cafe that limits its location to specific areas. You will now be allowed to do it anywhere you can have a cafe as of right. Those areas that are the residential areas that are grandfathered in, they would benefit from being able to seek a permit for a sidewalk cafe.
So you're
So there's
talking
no
about,
change to underlying zoning designations.
you're talking about having sidewalk cafes in residential areas?
So only in the areas where there's already a restaurant. It's been there since, let's say, the 30s, continuously predating 1961 zoning. So that's an area where you have a lot of eating and drinking establishments. That's the wonky term for a restaurant. But if you were to build it today in residential area, you couldn't build a restaurant. But there are many grandfathered restaurants in the city, several of them in CB11. Those
Name me a
restaurants,
couple.
I'm sorry,
Name me a couple.
I cannot name you. Well, actually, if you go to slide, that's probably the one I can name offhand.
Like the Italian restaurant that used to be on Marathon many years ago, I forget the name of it.
It's very common.
That was in what is now a residential area, if it still
Ambella's.
exists.
You talking about Ambella's?
If it's, yeah, right, correct. So, if you have a continuous, pre-1961 zoning.
How would they put a sidewalk restaurant outside Ambella's?
It's just an example, I think. I
It's-
think
it's-
all
Well, yeah, it's
is-
important to note that they could apply, but they would still have to meet the citing criteria. That was what I was discussing.
But the basic point, Alan, that's not a change, right? I mean, those places, those restaurants in those locations already.
I circled these because the blue and green are
Apply as
terrible
well.
at being
These
differentiated. So these are the
apply
restaurants
on residential
specifically.
areas.
It's kind of just
And I
opening it up a little bit.
I wanna say
more.
this
The
one
same
is
way it's
this.
opening up for other restaurants.
Right.
Just pizzas
I have a
on
bunch of
Bell?
questions.
No, this is not Bell.
This is not Bell.
No, this is closer to like 39th.
So I have a bunch of questions. The first one being, running of electricity. Is that gonna be fully within DOT permit and purview and examination purview as well?
I'm right, I know that's come up a
These are
lot.
all unclosed though, right?
So you would only be allowed unenclosed sidewalk cafes. No, you're allowed to have umbrellas. You're
I would
allowed
assume you're not gonna run electricity into unenclosed spaces.
Well, I wouldn't assume that.
Well, you
Because
should.
we've seen it. We've got it. So, question is, what is the definition of enclosed?
Yeah.
What will the definition of enclosed be? Because right now it means as long as it's not a box that shuts completely. Is that what it'll still be?
No, I mean, I think from the DOT side, we want to see more sightlines, we want to see more permeability. A roof is okay to give some shade. So the short answer is the design guidelines are still being worked out. We're probably going to be working it out for the next year. But we don't want to see a box.
Okay. And so casement windows are gonna go away.
I
Plywood structures that are essentially just buildings are gonna go away.
Yeah, that would, the long-term goal for the permanent program is to have removable structures in the street that are out during the winter months to facilitate snow removal. And then you won't need heating in that
Okay. Okay, so you're looking for sidewalk cafes, maybe bordering in the street, but you're not looking for semi-permanent sheds.
Correct.
The shed structures that are driving everybody a little bit nuts,
Right.
those are going away. Okay.
Because I think the two biggest pieces of feedback that we got with the current COVID sort of emergency regs that people don't like is the unsightly nature of some of the sort of semi-permanent structures. It's not very beautiful, one strips of, that were previously nice looking. And then secondly, the piece that's actually in the street itself. So that was gonna be my question. Is there a sense of how far this is gonna go? You know, is it really gonna be a sidewalk cafe, or are we talking about kind of what's going on now with parking spots and?
Well, one thing I could definitely say is that the zoning text portion of it only relates to
No, I
sidewalk
understand,
cafes.
I understand, but you know how this is gonna go over in the meeting in a couple of weeks, because everyone's gonna talk about the whole thing.
Oh, no, and the
To the extent we have
program.
any information about it, it's good to just.
No, I'll have that.
This is just the zoning restriction removal piece, I get it, then DOT's gonna pass whatever regs they're gonna pass. But is there a sense of that?
So it's gonna be both, it's the sidewalk component and it's the roadway component. Okay, but, so a restaurant will be able to come to DOT and apply for both, either or, as long as they meet the citing criteria. So you will be able as a restaurant to put it in the street as long as the regulations allow for it. So like I said, no bus stops, no hydrants, et cetera. So you will be allowed to do that, but it's gonna be a fee-based structure. The design criteria is going to be spelled out to the point where, we're not gonna see the variation that we see now, which is, some places keep it nice and open, they have a little cover to it. Some places build a box. Some people are running HVAC to it, all.
We've had situations where people fully enclose it and put a gas generator in it.
Right.
So I mean, that's been a bit of a problem.
Yeah, understood. And I think the idea here is it's been successful and people have seen the benefits of having outdoor dining. And we want to figure out the best way to keep in place as we continue the recovery and really tighten up the guidelines to the point where between the guidelines and the uptick in enforcement, this works better for everybody.
Okay, but now, maybe I'm wrong, I think there was one part was, I think propane tanks, or the propane heaters are specifically identified as not being allowed.
Right, yeah, I mean, so the guidelines for heating elements are, they all went through the fire department. So the specifics to what's allowable, I frankly have to brush up on, Joe. But more often than not, folks were definitely pushing the limits, I'd say.
I mean, yeah, one of our major concerns, we had a restaurant or two that were staining wood and putting generators within those boxes.
Right.
So it was a valid safety concern. In lieu of the community board review process, Scott,
Yep.
will there be, and I guess this might end up being a question more for DOT, will there be any sort of neighborhood consideration or formal review process when it comes to individual applications? Or will it just be streamlined totally through DOT the same way the health department with a restaurant license?
I'm pretty sure that even after this, the rule for, I talked about how we got rid of the full rule process, but today you still are required, predating the suspension of the rules, you were required to send them to the community board. I don't know if you're required to hold hearings. You might know better. Did you hold hearings before?
For sidewalk
For
cafes?
sidewalk cafes?
Yeah, we
Yeah.
had, it
So
was
that's
a 60-day review process.
Yeah, that would still exist, but the application itself would be at Department of Transportation, no longer DCA, or DCWP.
So we'll get certified mail every time someone puts one up?
Sidewalk.
Yes, but as soon as when they apply for them, they will be referred to the community board.
That's good.
Yeah, well, that doesn't change. That's something I should highlight.
People are gonna like
The roadway.
Yeah, that's gonna be
The
important.
roadway component, Joe, is different. That's a new component to the open restaurants
Mhm.
program. And I think we foresee that operating more on like receiving feedback from the community board. So
Okay.
not necessarily, coming to the board for a vote on every single roadway setup,
We'd
but
be notified in case it's problematic, we could meet on it.
correct.
Gotcha, good. That's gonna be important.
And just to understand that, because, I think people, if you look at Bell Boulevard right now, and it's pretty much up and down Bell, you have these semi-permanent structures. And I know you're saying they're not gonna be semi-permanent, but in terms of, so would every one of those restaurants be able to apply for a roadway cafe and keep that up, call whatever it is, 7 to 8 months a year? That's the kind of concept that we're talking about here?
Yeah.
So for whatever it's
So
worth, I think
it would
you
just
are
not
gonna.
be, it wouldn't be for the winter months.
So what are we calling winter months?
I mean, I would say it's yet
You know,
to
if
be
you say
determined.
winter is October, somebody else is gonna say, no, winter is December or
Yeah.
January. What
It
is
would
winter?
probably be November through February.
And that's gonna be spelled out someplace?
It will, once the design process, once that's all done. Yeah, and that process isn't happening in a bubble, that process is gonna have opportunity for community board feedback too.
Yeah, I would just sort of put it out there, like, in a community like ours, a lot of the feedback you're gonna hear is gonna be about parking spaces for those
Mhm.
motor. But I can tell you that, in my mind, the more practical issue is that, it does create a vehicle hazard.
Yep.
And I realize that, I think things have gone, in the big picture, it seems to me reasonably well with this. It's a different situation. COVID has created a certain amount of, whatever you want to call it, sympathy, cooperation amongst people with all of these things.
Right.
That maybe in ordinary times is not going to be quite so high. And I do have concerns. The biggest danger in our community is vehicular injury and death, in my view.
Yeah.
And I do think to get a corridor like Bell, which is relatively bustling, not particularly wide, when you put sidewalk cafes in the roadway, not sidewalk, roadway cafes on both sides of the street, it's hard for me to imagine over a few year period that we're not gonna see a significant vehicular accident. Because cars double park, they just are going to do that. And those double park cars, and you see now, if you were to go to Bell on a Friday night, you're gonna see cars parked on this side of these sidewalk cafes, and drivers opening doors out into traffic a full, 8 feet further than they would have been doing otherwise. I'm wondering if you guys are gonna do traffic studies about this, because I obviously one fatality over a few year period is one fatality too many.
Absolutely.
And I have a real concern about this, particularly for our community. I'm sure it's even worse in some of the more, long story short is it seems to me like there's some kind of volume or alternate side of the street thing that seems appropriate to me to be thought about. I just can't imagine it not happening, and, it's a problem around here, I can say at least.
Yeah, I think all that very valid points, and it's not something that we're not considering.
But I'm also looking at Northern Boulevard. You gotta be joking. They have parking restrictions to afford the commuters another lane to go home and to go down different hours.
Right.
And here sit these boxes. And trying to watch these cars, and there's not that many of them now, but wait a while, there'll be more. And they're weaving in and out.
So you're saying that there were open restaurant roadway setups in the rush hour? Okay, well, that's something.
And
that
they're
we
in
can look
the, they're coming out 8
at.
feet.
Because they shouldn't be in a lane that is designated as a travel lane
Right.
when, even if it's for a few hours a day. So, where on Northern Boulevard are you seeing?
I want you to go look at all of that because I'm
Are you seeing any
conscious of it
specific
when I go
restaurants?
past.
Are you seeing any specific restaurants that have done that?
I'm thinking of Baraka came out with one, there's that Greek restaurant. Joe,
That's all parking lane though.
But
Yeah,
but the parking lanes are cleared for rush hours.
No, they're not.
Not past Douglas Parkway, no.
They're supposed to.
It's
be.
hourly parking, 9 to 6.
So there are rush hour regulations that for sections of Northern Boulevard, but I think past Douglas Parkway that it's just metered parking.
This for years was done.
Over here, Baraka, the Thai place, it's all metered parking there. It's not no standing for travel lanes like over by the mile. That would be a different story. That's a dedicated travel lane. I think that's what you
Right.
said. That's what you said,
exactly
right?
Right. Yeah, there's basically, I mean, that's from Flushing all the way down. I mean, there's a, like you said, there's a rush hour regulation that allows for people returning back home. I remember we came to the community board 7 and 11 on that years ago, allowing that extra lane. Yeah, but yeah, on the Little Neck side, the Douglaston side, that's not in place. But to your point, if a restaurant cannot set up in the roadway, if the existing regulation is a travel lane at that time. So if it's a no standing anytime, a no stopping anytime, bus stop. I had a restaurant on Woodhaven Boulevard set up in the middle of the bus stop. So, and they got,
I'm not surprised.
that was enforced, they received a cease and desist order, and they were forced to remove their setup. And they removed it.
I still think that the concern for me is gonna be, you're in those lanes that are like traffic. If you put up a more significant barrier, which makes sense for safety reasons, whether it's a planter or whatever, that just promotes people trying to build a park on the other side of it. And if you just have tables, people aren't gonna park right next to a table with no barrier, but then you've got no barrier from traffic. And just, like I said, I cannot imagine over the course of an extended period of time, this being a permanent policy, that you aren't going to see accidents because of this. I guess what I'm wondering here is like, to what end economically is it worth it if we're gonna see increased fatalities and significant injuries, even one? Whereas to me, for whatever it's worth, getting rid of the red tape to allow people to make more money off public space that's available to them and we can, as a community, give up, that's great. And I think it makes the city a better place. But the second you go off that curve, you're increasing danger. And in COVID, when all these people are going out of business, and that creates its own hardships and frankly, potentially its own injuries, whatever you want to call it, there's a cost benefit. Once COVID is over, now we're basically talking about money versus safety. And to me, that's a significant consideration. Because you could do a significant amount of red tape cutting, increase capacity by limiting this to the sidewalk, and I'm sure a lot of people get a lot of benefit out of that. You start putting that into the street, I don't know, for me, the cost benefit changes.
Yeah, is there a public comment a part to the rulemaking process?
Specific to
The design
Oh,
design
the rulemaking
guidelines,
process.
things like that are gonna be finalized?
my understanding is that there is.
So that's
30-day
definitely
review
some,
process.
I think that's,
Every
I think
agency.
you're probably saying what is become,
Yeah.
number one, is beyond just neighborhood character and quality of life is safety. So I certainly think DOT is probably,
I'm
Yeah.
sure this is not a unique comment.
No, it's.
no, but it's an important one to be heard.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's a fair point. I think our hope is that the design guidelines will kind of remove a lot of the safety concerns. Because what we see often now is setups that aren't safe and they have poor visibility. And if we can really drill down as to what is safe and what people can see around, that coupled with the enforcement will make it a safer approach. But to your point, you're right. I mean, as we progress through this, changes will likely need to be made.
Well, it's just a question of ambition, right? Because in the end, there's a lot of stuff you can do to cut down vehicular traffic in the city, right? There's a lot of stuff you can do to make this a city that's intended to be more pedestrian friendly, more biker friendly, and have fewer cars. But if you're just gonna put people out in the street and not do anything to cut down the traffic running through those major thoroughfares, it just seems to me a disaster waiting to happen.
Well, it's a double-edged sword too, because if you can only have the thin sort of, now, I don't know what you'd call them, the thin sort of railway barriers only, certain restaurants aren't even gonna be interested if they're on a busy enough thoroughfare. That's not gonna be enough on
Yeah.
Northern Boulevard,
Yeah.
to make someone feel like they're enjoying their time. The reason why they put like all those planters outside, the pizzeria right over here, is because when you're on Northern, that's a lot of
I'm
vehicular
gonna say, who
traffic.
the heck wants to stand here and have food and get fumes from the traffic?
And Bella's quite nice, I think. I think Bella's quite nice, but I just think it's a different situation. People think, everything is being thought of differently right now by people. And the second you go permanent, and this is, people are 3 months after this is not as serious, it's gonna be in the rearview mirror. Everyone's gonna be fighting and yelling and something, who knows? Anyway,
Bell's also a 25 zone.
And to that point,
Yeah,
That's
but you're
actually
putting in-
Northern is a 35 zone, so there's a difference
you have
there.
to work through that there's going to be a fee structure now.
Yeah.
It's no longer gonna be a free program where any restaurant can just simply throw it out there and self-certify.
Right.
So we think there will be some sorting in that way too. That people will say, it's not worth it for me,
I have 3 wonky questions and I'll shut up for the rest of the night. First one is, does DOT have a plan in place to advocate during the budget season for an increased hire of inspectors? Because you're gonna need a lot of them.
I mean, our understanding is that as this process is a mayoral priority, we made an announcement in September 2020, that we would be funded for enhanced enforcement.
Good, okay.
So that will be a continued ask.
But you don't have anything in the budget, there's no line item that says inspectors.
That, I mean, I can't point to that, I'm not privy to the exact budget items.
And this program wouldn't be permanent until 2023.
Right.
I'll send you take a pay cut.
Yeah, so it would need to be right, that specific fiscal year budget, because that's when this will go into effect.
So this is for 2023, so I'm sorry that I'm late, you'll excuse me, but you came to us to show us, to
The zoning
preview
text amendment
this?
is happening now.
I'm sorry.
This is for the zoning text amendment only. All the stuff we're talking about DOT, that's really for the future. This vote is on the zoning text amendment. That's gonna happen just to remove the zoning restrictions from the permanent policy, not the DOT regulations that are gonna be put into place over the next.
Yeah, but most people would consider this is, I'm buying a pig in a poke if you don't have the rules and regulations and I don't know what I'm buying.
It's a good point. Fair enough.
And, one thing I would sort of relate to that, but also when we were talking very briefly about the sort of, everyone, everyone's gonna start doing this, once these rules make it more flexible. That map that showed the pre-COVID, showed that there was 0 sidewalk cafes. Now, the whole roadway program provides this new potential for more square footage for restaurants, so that's perfectly, I think, reasonable concern for expansion. But before COVID, and I think God willing, we're hoping that it's gonna be a post-COVID world, that environment, there was no sidewalk cafes. There were no sidewalk cafes licensed.
One,
So
just one.
they're there. Well, our map doesn't show, so they're probably on license, so I'm not gonna identify that restaurant. I'm not gonna identify that restaurant.
One on North?
No, on Bell and whatever that was, 38, 39.
Oh.
Yeah, it was. Doesn't matter. I agree with that. I think most people agree with that. I think it's just a question of, the devil's in the details.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, fully enclosed sidewalk cafes, those are going away completely, no new applications ever again, only the grandfathered ones will remain.
That's my understanding. From the zoning perspective, it eliminates all sidewalk cafes. So the licensing of a sidewalk cafe is subject to DOT rules.
And DOT is not gonna look for anything fully enclosed ever again, so it closes that loophole.
Correct.
Okay.
But still grandfathering those businesses. We're not telling existing legal enclosed cafes, they have to
Right, correct.
remove those materials.
Last thing for me is,
Well, wait a minute, they have to be out of there during the winter.
When I say enclosed, it's, I'm referring specifically to where you see these expansion of buildings from the actual building that existed pre-COVID, not these temporary buildings. You see them jutted
You
out,
can see it in the package, it's like those diners have the extended, almost like a
Plexiglass,
closed.
Yeah.
Yes,
whatever,
exactly.
yeah.
no new ones
Slide
of those
17.
ever again.
Slide 17.
that's a type of structure on public property that will not be allowed any longer.
You see the photo on slide 17?
Yeah,
That's a good example.
The 17 itself is quite little.
I'm looking at page 17, is that what you're telling me?
Yeah, that's one of the example.
there's
Restaurant on
nothing-
Upper West Side, I think.
There's nothing in this in CB allowed.
I don't believe there's any in CBO. I thought there was one on Bell, further closer to Open Gardens, but I was wrong. I think there was one that applied 20 years ago.
yeah,
It was a diner by, just north of Windsor Park.
yeah,
So they
yeah,
came
Bell,
out-
on Bell and 73rd. They
Yeah,
had applied for years ago, they didn't get it.
yeah, I think I've already seen that. I think that's why I thought there was one. But yes, that's an example of an enclosed cafe. This is
They came
pre-COVID.
out 8 feet or whatever and just took over.
Yeah, they, most of them did it legally. They got a revocable consent from the city's law department to allow them to build in these areas. But it's not something that the permanent program is looking to be part of the program anymore.
So my last question is, and again, it's really a DOT question for eventual permitting of these. When you have things like liquor licenses, because they're about nightlife and because there's a major safety component, as there will be with these, when you have 4 within 500 feet, there's a saturation point in which the local community gets more attention put to those applications when you have a saturation point met. Is DOT thinking about implementing some sort of a formal or informal saturation point with, within 200 feet, you have 4 or 8 of these? At that point, is there a higher threshold or a full-on ban?
Joe, are you asking specifically about not the restaurants themselves, but just the portion that is either on the roadway or sidewalk?
Yeah, no, not like you, not like too many restaurants in the area. Yeah, I'm talking about, sidewalk cafes or open street cafe permits.
So if there was like 3 restaurants, 2 would have a sidewalk cafe with liquor, and only 1 would be.
Not even just with liquor, I'm just saying, just in general, like, when you get your liquor license, if there's 4 of you within 500 feet, someone else applies for one, the process is a little bit stricter because you're starting to slowly build a nightlife corridor.
And I'm not answering for that, I was just curious
Yeah,
about.
it gets more attention.
Yeah. No,
So I'm curious if there's something like that that's being thought about.
It is being thought about. I'd say that as we go through the rulemaking design process, it's a consideration, but I can't speak to like how many per, you know.
Yeah, and I'm not even asking if it would be a hard ban, I'm just asking if at a certain point then there's an extra level of consideration
Yeah.
as to exactly what that particular block or 2 blocks might start to look like. You know, not that you're giving one to one versus another, but that you're starting to consider the fact that you're really changing the terrain in a way that, you know, even though it's a 2-year lease, you know, it would be significant.
Yeah, it's a fair point. I think it has to go in through the rulemaking process.
Yeah,
that
okay.
consideration.
And, I'm sorry.
No, it's just, you know.
No, this is not zoning text amendment stuff. This is
Right.
just-
Yeah,
Right.
no, but I'll be blunt, you know, I never thought that I'd be getting into the restaurant business.
Yeah, Yeah.
So that's a new reality, and it's an activity that takes place within the map right of way of New York City streets, so that's why we're being affected.
I have a question. You're saying this is going into 2023, but we're going to have an election, we're gonna have change of mayoralty. Why push this now?
Well, the program, whether it's at DOT or staying at DCA, is going to happen in some form or another. And it is going to be subject to city council, the rulemaking process for DOT.
Yeah, but they're all gonna be new also. I mean,
I
what
mean,
are
I
we
think,
doing here is what
I
I'm
think any
asking you.
administration would reserve the right to, they could reverse it. They would reserve that anyway, any elected official could.
Right, yeah, it's a
So
fair
is it your plan to put in something or to try to put something in that then an administration would have to start combing through everything that agencies have put in because they had another mayor? And now they're gonna have to stand there and look at everything to see whether or not they're happy about it.
Well, I mean.
Or people are standing there screaming because they can't move. They can't get, and I'm going to talk about Northern Boulevard because Bell Boulevard, we all know, has got problems. But the fact of the matter is, Northern Boulevard is the east-west. And if you start having all these things out there, now you've only got 2 lanes of traffic where before you had 3. And now they open the doors, as Joe said. Now you got 1 lane of traffic. How are you gonna move traffic, 1 lane of traffic?
Yeah, so I mean, what I would say is, you know, for the next administration, the rulemaking process will take place under the first year of the new administration. So the text amendment is meant to essentially take away the geographic restrictions as to sidewalk cafes that exist right now, and to put the whole program, instead of, you know, you have to go to DOT for revocable consent, or potentially the law department, and DCWP for a sidewalk cafe. The text amendment change is really meant to simplify it and put it all under DOT's umbrella. So.
But it's also meant to remove restrictions.
Right, but the rulemaking, so the specifics are gonna be done under the first year of the next administration. So to that point, we're not saddling the next administration, because they're gonna be at the top of the decision-making pole for the ultimate permanent program. So that's, you know.
But you're asking people to sign off on something where there's no rules and regulations that they can look at and say, this is what it exactly is going
Just
to.
not 100%, that's not a total.
It's not any
correct
percent from what I'm
characterization,
hearing.
Because the program exists right now. There's a sidewalk cafe that exists right now under DCWP, okay? There's an existing open restaurants program that exists right now under DOT. So this zoning text amendment would simplify that and just put them all under DOT's umbrella. So
You really need a zoning text amendment to put everything under DOT?
Yeah, legally, yes.
So if you were to look at the text that is subject to review from the community board, what you're essentially gonna see is the whole portion of chapter related to zoning sidewalk with the strike through is completely removed. So upon approval, the zoning, the sidewalk cafe zoning regulations are gone. Doesn't mean they don't, there's certain rules won't apply when DOT creates their program, but the rules in zoning, they limit where they're allowed to be geographically. That rule is going away because you're only allowed to have a sidewalk cafe in limited spaces. Those places that they're allowed today, or even pre-COVID in CB11, those really are unchanged. Those commercial districts, we allowed to have an eating and drinking establishment, a restaurant. Many of those, most of those, allow a sidewalk cafe to be on the next to the building. Pre-COVID, pre-today and pre-COVID. Those were allowed today. They're still being proposed to be allowed. What is being proposed is removing the sidewalk regulations that provided even more prohibitions in special districts that aren't in CB11, and those very few restaurants that are grandfathered in residential districts. So I just want to make it clear that the very narrow scope of the text amendment doesn't really change where the sidewalk cafes are allowed today, or compared to pre-COVID.
A legal process and permitting process will be replaced by a permitting process only, through an agency rather than through several plus a community board. The law department.
The administration
consent.
part isn't the community board, the community board has a review process.
Right,
That's
so what I'm
something-
saying is
that's not-
currently when you have revocable consent, a legal process, consumer affairs,
Right.
then another public hearing, then a zoning change, then the permit, it'll all be replaced with a permitting process with DOT. So it's a legal process with others, replaced with something more streamlined. That's what we're really talking about just tonight.
Yeah.
But that permitting process is still to be determined, which is Joan's concern.
No zoning change, there's no zoning.
Correct.
I think that's a fair count.
Have you gone before the other community boards with this?
So this is a 90-day referral period. It's all 59 community boards. It's a citywide text amendment. This will apply
And
to
what's
all.
been the reception from the other community boards?
The only one I know so far, I know 14's land use committee, yesterday was 9 or 10, I think it was 9 maybe. I talked to Joy, she's the planner liaison for CB9. She said she had a really good conversation with the board and her Jason.
Right, my colleague.
Yeah. So they had a really robust conversation there. They had a lot of similar concerns regarding parking, loss of parking.
Yeah.
I think there were some concerns possibly raised about potential safety concerns.
Yeah, I attended CB5, and the concerns were primarily about permanent parking laws. But I think, one thing I mentioned there is that the roadway component of this would be seasonal, so it would no longer, the idea would be to have to be removed, and as we mentioned, probably from November through February, the winter months.
Are both of you guys gonna be at the September 13th meeting?
But we have a date? So
Yes.
So right now, it's just gonna be me. DOT really, city planning is pretty tight staffing. DOT, I would say on a per capita basis is even more stripped away recently, so it's just gonna be me. And it will be more
Now,
narrow.
that's all the information that Al, presented, and it's
Yeah.
obviously specifically gonna be on text and we're voting on anyway.
Yeah,
So we're not gonna be able to vote on this as a committee tonight, we don't have a quorum.
Sure.
We got the information, we'll be able to present that to the board, as an introduction, Scott, when we speak on the 13th. And,
I'll actually be at CB7 on the 13th.
You'll be at CB6.
and I'll touch base with Al, there's certain things I can't answer, but I think I got a pretty good.
Well, that's part of the reason that we talked about tonight too, so we,
Yeah.
Joan and I can.
I'll run down the hallway at Borough Hall.
And I think John makes very good points. It's fair to say, we don't have it all worked out right now.
And where's the zoning that I'm supposed to be looking at? The zoning text?
I can provide you a copy of the actual change to the text. We don't generally put it on slides because it's very,
Yes.
there's a link
Very
on.
nice. Have you got it, Joe?
We mailed it, it was mailed to you with the agenda that you got tonight, that's why you're here. It It was in the same envelope,
No,
yes. And-
It's not long.
I got a one piece of paper that said meeting tonight.
We'll talk about that offline, but, okay.
And I'll send, Joe already has it. If you don't have a digital copy, I can send you a digital copy.
Yeah, no, we have it, it's on the website,
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
yes.
And so December 13th, would that, let's say,
So, I think 7:30, right now it's KCS, it may end up, we'll see what happens with the state vote, see if
State
we
vote
vote
on
on that on Zoom. But otherwise, as of right now, KCS, our standard, in person, 7:30.
case, oh, Korean service.
Korean
social
service,
service.
exactly. Same, I don't know, have you been there?
I've been there a few times. I forgot about it. Yeah.
That's where we have our in-person meetings, we'll
That's
see
a
how long-
Monday?
how well this plays out, but Monday, 7:30,
Monday, 7:30? Okay.
Monday afternoon.
Well, who do I have to bribe to get early on the agenda?
No bribes necessary. We'll get you as quick as we can. Okay, thanks everybody for coming. Appreciate it. We're gonna adjourn tonight.
Thanks, thank you.
Thank you.
I got 13,
dry out there.
13 to CB11, 14 to CB8.
John, thank you for coming.
Yeah, 14th.
Are you gonna be at that? Okay, so maybe I'll touch base with you, are you gonna do the full board?
That said move meeting.
That's the full board, yeah.
Joan, I know that the